We're pleased to have Pat Marida present our program this evening, which is about nuclear issues in Ohio and beyond. Pat is a graduate of Ohio State University with a Bachelor of Science in Pharmacy. She spent her life in community pharmacy and is now retired. She has been a community activist since the 1980s when she volunteered with the Ohio Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign. Since the 1990s, Pat has volunteered with the Sierra Club. She served as chair of the Central Ohio Sierra Club for 9 years and was an executive committee member of the Ohio Sierra Club for about 15 years. During that time, she chaired the Central Ohio group. They took legal action against the city of Columbus for their sanitary sewer overflows. This resulted in the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency enforcing 2 consent decrees, which forced the city to address the problem. For the last 15 years, Pat has also chaired the Ohio Sierra Club's Nuclear Free Committee. She is a core team member of the National Sierra Club's Nuclear Free campaign, where she works with Sierrans and others across the US and in Canada. Pat Marida.
Oh, thank you very much, Leslie. I really appreciate this opportunity. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint screen now, and you can all watch that. Okay, here we are with the full screen. There's so many nuclear issues in Ohio right now that I might not get real far into the beyond. On this website, there's our Sierra Club, the link to our website. If you notice, all of the yellow underlined are hyperlinks, so you can go there and see what we have on our website. And Sierra Club policy opposes nuclear power and weapons. So we'll start off with the Great Lakes, because Ohio has our Great Lake Erie. And the green is the Great Lakes watershed. And so everything in that green drains into the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes have every aspect of the nuclear industry there, from uranium mining, milling, refining, uranium enrichment, the nuclear power plants, 34 of them commercial reactors on the Great Lakes, and of course the waste. So in Ohio, we have 2 nuclear plants on Lake Erie, and Davis-Besse here is east of Toledo. So the history of Davis-Besse, it's famous for having the hole in its head. They managed to get inspections delayed for some time, and they ignored earlier inspections, which you see in the upper left-hand corner is what they viewed, but they didn't take that top part off. So they didn't notice this whole football-sized hole had been eaten away by boric acid, leaving only 1/8 inch of stainless steel liner between Davis-Besse and disaster, because the water would have quickly evaporated and the fuel would have started to melt down very fast if that reactor pressure vessel was breached. So this is a picture of Davis-Besse flooding under construction. Now, it's a good thing this didn't happen when it's operating. It would cause a really serious problem. This is caused by what they call a seach. It doesn't happen real often, but it clearly did happen. The Great Lakes are quite high right now, and when the wind blows strong in a certain direction, this is what can happen. So all nuclear power plants have regular radioactive releases. They release radioactivity into the air legally, and they all leak tritium into the water, that's radioactive hydrogen. So they take in a lot of water for cooling, and just the mechanics of that causes a lot of fish, kills a lot of fish, kills invertebrates and anything that's in the water. And as it comes out, it's really hot. And it helps, of course, promote algal blooms. We're not talking a small amount of water. Indian Point in New York uses as much water as the city of New York. And you can see, well, there's a major destruction of wetlands with the building of this plant. So some of the issues that Davis-Besse, in 2014, there were 2 new steam generators installed, but they were not compliant with regulations mandating like for like. So they wanted to get more juice out of it, so they put in more tubes closer together. And problem with that is that they can rub and get holes in them. And so this was a problem at San Onofre, and those reactors were forced to close because of that problem. So what else is wrong there? Well, there's an outer concrete shield building that's cracking because it has rebar inside of the concrete, and the cracking is worsening. Now, so there's a danger of collapse of tons and tons of cement onto the reactor or on critical components outside the reactor. So when Davis-Besse was up for its license extension, First Energy, the owner, said the cracks weren't growing. But anyway, they painted it because they thought that would stop the water from getting in. Well, actually, it sealed water in, and the cracks are now worsening. And indeed, they are spreading. But in 2015, the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that is, granted a 20-year license extension until 2037. So the Sierra Club and others intervened in that, and we managed to at least delay the process for about 3 years. Now, the commission has never turned down a license application. And currently, there have been 89 reactors that have been given extensions, and 2 have been allowed to run for 80 years, when the engineered lifespan is only 40 years. So this is the Perry plant, which is east of Cleveland. You can see from the map its location. It's on Lake Erie, and it's on a fault line. And that is one of Ohio's most frequent earthquake zones. That fault line was discovered actually when it was under construction. And the reactor suffered a 5.0 earthquake while it was under construction. In 2011, Perry was named by Reuters as the most dangerous nuclear power plant in the world, and that was in terms of danger to workers. It had 2 units that were built. The second one was never completed. It was canceled back in 1994 due to design flaws. But all the major structures of that second unit were completed, all the costs and everything. The cooling tower was even completed, as you can see. There it is. No steam is coming out of it, although the promotional picture on the right kind of makes it look like there's steam coming out. Well, First Energy is the owner of Davis-Besse and Perry, or was, and also 2 reactors at Beaver Valley in Pennsylvania. And that location is 4 miles from the Ohio border. So their subsidiary, First Energy Solutions, went into bankruptcy, and they came out as Energy Harbor Limited Liability Corporation. So there was a good reason for all of that, because these reactors were actually somewhat profitable, but there was a big liability. Well, now Energy Harbor has it's not a subsidiary, it's a completely different organization. So First Energy has no liability, and Energy Harbor is a limited liability corporation. So there we have the reason for this transition. First Energy got about $9 billion in stranded costs when Ohio's utilities became deregulated in 2001. Then in 2013, the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio made First Energy refund $43 million to customers because they had charged an inflated price for renewable energy credits to their customers. Well, that tactic made renewable energy seem more expensive. It was an interesting trick because actually they paid their subsidiary to do this work. They overpaid their own subsidiary and then charged the public for it. In 2014, they were the driving force behind getting the Ohio legislature to freeze Ohio's renewable energy and energy efficiency law, and also to enact that wind turbine setback rules. And those rules required wind turbines to be so far away from roads or structures that it stopped all commercial wind farms in Ohio. And that law was actually tacked on at the very last minute to the budget bill. And many legislators didn't even know that that was in the bill. Northern Ohio, they have the highest electric rates in the state because of the cost of the nuclear plants. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission continues to give waivers to First Energy on safety and maintenance. And I have a link there to about 24 waivers that they have been given. So most people in Ohio have heard of House Bill 6. That was the First Energy bailout. That passed last July. There was a lot of controversy. And unusually, all the newspapers, almost every newspaper in Ohio just was so opposed to that because it gave First Energy $1.2 billion, just a gift, no strings attached, to support 2 nuclear and 2 coal plants, or so they say. One of those coal plants is actually in Indiana. The reason I said so they say is because they could, it's just a gift. But anyway, but this that wasn't enough to get that subsidy. It guts Ohio's renewable and energy efficiency standards, the same bill, House Bill 6. Now, $50 million was spent on lobbying, and large donations were made to candidates as far back as the Ohio Republican primaries. So they had this in mind a very long time before and tried to make sure that legislators were elected that would be friendly to them. So a group attempted to get a referendum on the ballot to overturn House Bill 6. And that was funded mostly by the oil and gas industry because we citizens can't afford that major, that was a big undertaking. But many of us in Ohio, we've all seen the opposition. Millions of dollars were spent opposing the referendum. There were fake petitions. They said there was going to be a Chinese takeover of our energy grid using the xenophobic Chinese references. We got mailers, we got phone calls, there were TV and radio and all kinds of ads. And something I'd never heard of, the signature gatherers were harassed and offered bribes to quit their jobs and collect signatures on the fake petitions. And the Cleveland Scene just last month had a long article detailing some of the intrigue in dark money and how it subsidized that opposition to the referendum. And it brought in Joanne Davidson, was a former Speaker of the House. She served in the Ohio House for a very long time. She was involved in trying to get First Energy their bailout, and there's an interesting intrigue in that article. She still has important positions in the Republican Party, and she was actually co-chair of the Republican National Committee at one point. Well, this slide goes to show that if you tell a lie often enough and loud enough, it becomes an accepted fact. zero emissions from nuclear power. Well, the fact is that nuclear power has quite a large carbon footprint. In fact, it's been shown, economic studies have been done showing that its footprint is a little bit less than natural gas. The footprint comes from uranium mining, milling, refining, uranium enrichment. They have to fabricate the fuel. They have to build the reactors. All along this chain, there's transportation. And then the waste has to be isolated for a few thousand years. So the studies that cost didn't really include the cost of isolation of waste for many years, for so many years. That was not included in the carbon footprint. Of course, nuclear continually generates high-level radioactive waste, and there is no plan for what to do with it. It's outside of the understanding of science as to what could be done with it, disposed of safely. So besides the high-level waste, all along the fuel chain, radioactivity gets released. And it's kind of ironic because many Republican legislators, they're climate change deniers, but they want to give credit to nuclear reactors because the nuclear chain reaction does not generate carbon, or they say emissions. Okay. Our next slide is New Green, and that's a facility on Lake Erie. It's right next to the Perry reactor and east of Cleveland. They clean and refurbish radioactive equipment. Now, our Ohio committee, we have ongoing requests to the Ohio Department of Health. We'd like to get information on their inventory and what they do with the, not just the things that they're cleaning, but also with the waste. You know, what happens to the sand if they're sandblasting these things? What happens to the water if they're washing these things? And so far, the Ohio Department of Health just says, well, we go up there and inspect it, and here's a report. Inspectors checked off everything okay, and this is all you can have because everything else is proprietary. So we're still pursuing that, though. Moving on to this one is making more headlines. Well, maybe we wish it were making more headlines so the public would know what's going on there. This is the Portsmouth nuclear site. It's located in Piketon, Ohio. It's actually not located in Portsmouth. And it covers about 4,000 acres. And the buildings you see there, they actually cover 97 acres under roof. Some of them are, the one in the foreground is 85 feet tall, the one in the center is 65, and the one at the far end is 45 feet tall. So they did uranium enrichment there starting in 1950s. It was enriched to make nuclear bombs during the Cold War. And later, they converted that to enriching uranium for nuclear power. So there's where it is. It's about 20 miles from the Ohio River. So this is a crash course on uranium enrichment. So enrichment, it increases the concentration of the fissionable or usable part of the uranium. That's the part that will split and cause the atomic reaction. 235 is the atomic weight of that part that's fissionable, but that's less than 1% of the amount of uranium. The 238, that won't sustain a chain reaction, and that is 99+% of the uranium. So enrichment, that concentrates the 235 up to 3 to 5% for power and 90% for weapons and submarines, although 20% can be used for a dirty bomb. So there's 3 different processes that have been used to enrich uranium, and in all cases, fluorine is added to the uranium. It makes uranium hexafluoride. And why they want that is because when uranium hexafluoride is a solid at room temperature, but when it's heated, it goes directly to a gas. It never goes through that liquid phase. So the gas then can be run through membranes, miles and miles and miles of membranes, because there's not much difference in the size of the 235 and the 238. And that's why it takes 100 acres under roof to do this. And that's what happened at Portsmouth. The second is the centrifuge. Now, you've all heard of Saddam Hussein having the aluminum tubes. Well, these are mighty big tubes, these centrifuges, but they're tall and they're round and they separate the uranium by weight through spinning. And there's only one commercial centrifuge plant in the United States now, and that's in New Mexico. They tried to build one at Portsmouth, the American centrifuge plant. It failed. The Sierra Club opposed its licensing back in 2003. And I will talk more about that American centrifuge plant in another slide. Third is the laser, and there's no full-scale plant. That process is much more efficient should it ever be built. It's a very big weapons proliferation concern because no one will know who is able to enrich uranium and make nuclear bombs, because this could be done in a small building, could be even done underground, so it can't be discovered by satellite like the outfit at Portsmouth could be. And there's no heat signature from laser either. The Department of Energy wants this to happen at the Paducah nuclear site that's in Kentucky. It's kind of a sister site to what's going on at Portsmouth. The state of Kentucky turned over 665 acres of the West Kentucky Wildlife Management Area, gave that land away adjacent to the Paducah nuclear site to a company that they hoped would build this laser facility. And then back in 2017, the Kentucky legislature overturned a state moratorium on nuclear activities, but they didn't mention the laser connection when they did this. But currently the price of uranium is so low that that nobody, the company has given up, at least for temporarily, on doing this laser process. So the laser, there's no full-scale plant, and there's a big weapons proliferation concern because the buildings are small. They're not needed. The very large buildings at Portsmouth aren't needed. In fact, this could even be put underground. And there's no heat signature. So other nations would really want to start doing the same thing. And the Department of Energy is greasing the skids for this to happen at the Paducah nuclear site in Kentucky, which is a sister site for Portsmouth. They also enriched uranium with the diffusion process for many years. Well, what's going on now at Portsmouth is cleanup of the gaseous diffusion plant, all the 97 acres of buildings. The site used as much electricity as New York City. If you go to that link, you can see a video made back during the Cold War where they brag about the fact that it used that much electricity. That was the Atomic Energy Commission made that brag. The operation was closed in 2001, but there was a legacy of contamination and sickened workers, and that is the title of a series that was in the Dayton Daily News. And you can go to that link and still see some of that series. So the buildings are to be raised, and the Sierra Club isn't opposed to burying the less radioactive demolition materials there. However, the Department of Energy misrepresented the geologic studies for the on-site disposal facility. So it's being dug above fractured rock, and it's being dug close to the aquifer. So even the best lining won't last past 1,000 years, and when that lining fails, then radioactivity will migrate to the aquifer. So what should not go in the landfill, and they're planning to put there, the pipes that contain the transuranic elements. Well, how did transuranic elements get to the Portsmouth nuclear site. Well, unbelievably, they brought in reprocessed high-level radioactive waste and ran it through the entire enrichment process for years, trying to extract some of the uranium and perhaps plutonium out of it. So the Department of Energy, they're not going to clean up all the old landfills. And some of the contents are unknown. And we're saying it would be really important to clean up all those landfills. The funding, that's not certain. It was slow getting started. And at the current funding, it's going to take about 40 years to finish the cleanup. Just last year, transuranics were found in a Department of Energy air monitor. And that was right outside the Zons Corner Middle School. That's about 4 miles away. In fact, that report came out in 2017, but it wasn't released to the public until 2019. So the Scioto Valley School Board closed and quarantined the school, but the Department of Energy maintained that the radioactivity came from somewhere else, unbelievably. And Michael Ketterer, an expert, had come in. He's one of the world's top experts in determining where these, the radioactive signature. He said, there's no doubt. He's proved beyond a doubt that that came from the facility. Pike County's cancer rate in 2019, last year, it was the second highest in Ohio. And that county's fairly not a lot of population in that county. Since that was found off-site and proven that neptunium and americium were found off-site, although plutonium has been found elsewhere and not within the air monitors that the DOE has put up. But 2 class action lawsuits were filed against the department after the school closed, and those were based on ill health that people have had. So what's continuing at Portsmouth besides the cleanup? There's the conversion plant that opened in 2011. It takes the fluorine off of the enrichment waste, off of the depleted uranium hexafluoride called DUF6. Now, the DUF6, the depleted uranium with the fluoride in it, it's highly corrosive because of the fluorine, and it's chemically reactive. So it's really important to take this off. Although the radioactivity isn't removed, it's still far less chemically reactive. Accidents closed that plant for 3 years. A new company now runs it, and it's going to take quite a few years to remove the fluorine from the 14-ton cylinders that are sitting there. There's 19,000 of them, and many of them are over 60 years old, and they're rusting, and some of them are leaking. The picture shows them bringing more cylinders to Portsmouth from Oak Ridge. And the Sierra Club, we all said that they didn't need more. They already had more than they could deal with. But anyway, here it shows one. The Department of Energy denied it, but we have a picture of it coming in an open bed truck, the cylinder. So the American Centrifuge plant, I talked about that before. It never opened, and it cost about $2.5 billion. We don't know how much was paid by taxpayers, but probably the bulk of that, even though it was privately owned. And that company went bankrupt, and they reorganized as Centris. So remember Centris, coming up in the next slide or two. So 11,000 centrifuges were planned, 120 were actually built, and the cleanup, as it was completed in 2018 because it needed more cleanup because 16 centrifuges crashed when they started up the 120, and one of them ruptured, spewing uranium out. There are 2 new war-making industries in the works at Portsmouth, and these have happened with no input from the public. And so the site is once again being turned into a major nuclear weapons production site. So the first of the two new processes, Centrus is the centrifuge people, is involved. They announced last December that they have a $115 million contract to make what they call high assay low enriched uranium, or HALEU. And this is about 19.75% of the fissionable part of uranium-235. 19.75% uranium-235. Whereas 20% is considered weapons usable and cannot be exported. So we see what they're trying to do just under the wire where they could export it. Now, it doesn't take too much imagination to figure they can, that this could be made into a dirty bomb or fairly easily enriched to 90%, which is bomb grade. So the Arms Control Association wrote an article, there's a link to, and they show that there are already 2 domestic sources of HALEU. They're cheaper than what Centrus would charge, and the Centrus building alone would cost over $10 billion. That's what the Arms Control Association estimates. The Project on Government Oversight wrote an article called "The Revolving Door Goes Nuclear," and there's a link to it. So Daniel Poneman, he's now the CEO of Centrus. He once was the #2 official at the Department of Energy under Obama. He became the CEO of Centrus less than 6 months after leaving the Department of Energy. And the poor guy only makes $2 million a year. So the nuclear watchdogs, there's an article there by the Midwest Energy News. They are warning against the blurring of between military and civilian uses at this plant. Because Centrus, they speak out of both sides of their mouth. At one point, they say that it's for civilian, and another, they say it's for military. So the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Reform, they're investigating secret negotiations between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia to export nuclear reactors and technology to Saudi Arabia. So the committee published 2 really scathing reports, and they asked for justification of the unbid contract. And there's links to both those reports there. The picture is the circled the Centrus buildings. That picture I actually took, it was of a model, and it's not an aerial shot. So this is the second recently announced war-making industry at Piketon, announced last January. So the picture is the Mid-America Conversion Facility. And what that does, it takes the fluorine off of the depleted uranium hexafluoride, which I talked about before. And this DUF6, the depleted uranium hexafluoride, it's highly chemically reactive. And it's eating its way out of the 14-ton cylinders. Some of them are shown there. There's about 19,000 of those currently on the site. And it's really important to remove that fluorine because otherwise it's not only radioactive, but it's also chemically reactive. So the radioactivity isn't removed. And the disposal of it is still a problem. It's still sitting, all of it that's been already deconverted is still sitting at Piketon. They're not sure what to do with it. But if we suddenly make it into a product, something really useful, we can use this to make depleted uranium for weapons. And this DUF4, which is an intermediate product in making the depleted uranium munitions, is what will be made down at Portsmouth. It's used in making armor-piercing shells. It's used in making bunker-buster bombs, and also as armor in tanks. Well, thousands of tons of depleted uranium munitions, they've been detonated in the former Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Serious health risks can occur if it's ingested or inhaled by people in war zones, such as people with the Gulf War syndrome, American veterans, or in test areas such as the former Jefferson Proving Ground in southern Indiana. The Army claims it's too dangerous to clean up. There's a link to that if you want to go read that article. And birth defects in Iraq have greatly increased. So we're working with an environmental attorney, Terry Lodge in Toledo. He has written a 16-page letter to the Department of Energy demanding a supplementary environmental impact statement, which is actually required for this process change. And the department responded answering the wrong questions. So now legal action is being taken. Well, what happens with nuclear waste? Well, there's a quadruple whammy. First of all, when nuclear waste first comes out of the reactor, it's really hot, and it's too hot to be stored. It has to be stored in water for at least 5 years. Some of the fuel that they're have high burnup fuel now, which burns longer and hotter, and it has to be cooled for even longer. And so currently some of the pools in the United States, they have 5 times as many fuel rods as they were designed to handle. Unbelievably, there's some really dangerous thin-wall dry storage canisters that this waste, once it comes out of the pools, is being put into. These are only 1/2 inch thick, or 1/2 inch thin, as we say. They're stainless steel. They're only warranted to last for 20 years. And these hold up to 55 tons in a 1/2 inch shell. They can't be inspected. They can't be monitored for internal damage, and they can't be repaired. And there's no protocol for opening them because they're welded shut. The NRC allows them to continue putting radioactive waste into these canisters. And there are now over 1,700 in the US, including Davis-Besse, Perry, and Beaver Valley. Well, what do we do with it? Well, how about consolidating it at some interim storage place? So the government wants to force unscientific solutions. We'll have a temporary storage plant, and we'll ship it around the country. We don't have a good reason, but except to get it away from the reactors, because the industry doesn't want it there. The utilities don't want it. Well, if it's interim, what happens to it? It either stays there permanently, or it gets moved again. So it's totally, there is no reason. Initially, the government promised that they wouldn't put it anywhere where a city or a town or a county didn't agree to take it. Well, since they didn't get any takers, they suddenly decided that they would let corporations volunteer. And so guess what? 2 corporations did volunteer, one in Texas and one in New Mexico. The Sierra Club has filed legal interventions to try to stop their licensing. And that's ongoing. There's proposed federal legislation, and this would really grease the skids. That's number 4, House Resolution 2699. It's the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act. And that would fast track moving high-level waste to interim storage. And it would also transfer ownership of waste to the public. Now, President Trump has said there's not going to be a permanent site at Yucca Mountain. He's canceling that. So supposedly they would be taking that out of this legislation. Well, what do we do with nuclear waste? Well, we say, the Sierra Club and all the anti-nuclear organizations around the country say, first step is to stop making it. Now, the Sierra Club signed on to the Principles for Safeguarding Nuclear Waste at Reactors. And what that says basically is that you store the waste as close as possible to the site of generation and as safely as possible. So there are some places where the waste is going to have to be moved. It's too close to the ocean, such as in San Onofre. It's in the middle of the Mississippi River, such as Prairie Island. So with global warming, there's greatly increased chances of flooding. But the realities are there isn't any permanent solution for radioactive waste. So what we really need to do is guard it much more safely than it is being done now at these reactor sites. And there's always the danger, the possibility, what happens if we lose institutional control of these things in such things as pandemics, wars, economic collapse? Imagine what would happen if we had a nuclear accident during this pandemic. Well, under Obama, the EPA passed a rule that that allowed radioactivity in drinking water to be increased. And some of the elements were allowed to be increased 1,000 times. And the Trump administration now wants to increase the amount to 10,000 times what it was. We wonder, well, just what are they expecting to happen? And I think that the cartoon here really shows how it's being dealt with. So on to nuclear weapons and war. There is a heightened threat of nuclear war now. 9 countries have about 14,000 weapons. The US and Russia have the most. It's been tracked, and they found that there is about $116 billion in contracts worldwide. And likely it's much higher because not all of it can be tracked. The Obama administration proposed spending about $1.2 trillion to upgrade the US nuclear weapons, and that would be over the next 30 years. The Trump administration increased that to $1.7 trillion, and it's currently being funded. Well, continued wars threaten escalation. Bombings and civilian casualties continue in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria. The US military is involved in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan. And Donald Trump recklessly threatening war with North Korea and Iran. And he's taken the United States out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia and out of the Iran nuclear deal. So this past January, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved its doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight. And that's the closest ever. And part of that is because of global warming and the overlapping threat between nuclear weapons and global warming. So it's not all bad news. There is good news. Back in 2017, the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted by a favorable vote of 122 nations. And it will come into effect when 50 nations have ratified it. And so far, 35 nations have ratified, which is really great, very fast, only 15 to go. And the Sierra Club officially supports this treaty. Well, what happens with this treaty? Well, when it goes into effect, all the 50 nations will have to immediately end all nuclear weapons research and development. They will not be able to host any R&D from any other countries, nor will they be able to have like airplanes land or ships dock that have nuclear weapons. And it also will kind of make pariahs out of the 7 nuclear nations, and that's all important. The second thing is ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. The Sierra Club became a partner with them. They're getting more and more partner organizations. And they were in fact the group that initiated the treaty. And for doing that, they won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Then last year, the Sierra Club endorsed the Back from the Brink campaign. And that is a national policy within the U.S. Advocating 5 steps to reduce the chances of nuclear war. And those steps include renouncing first use, ending the unchecked authority of a U.S. president to launch a nuclear attack. It includes taking all U.S. weapons off of hair trigger alert and canceling this upgrade of nuclear weapons. That was started under the Obama administration, outlining $1.3 trillion to be spent for this work. The Trump administration since then has upped it to $1.7 trillion. And the last of the 5 is pursuing a verifiable agreement among the 7 nuclear states to eliminate their weapons. And I'm happy to say that our committee helped shepherd the Sierra Club's endorsement of those institutions and organizations. And there's something we can all do. Down there at the bottom is a link to Don't Bank on the Bomb, where you can go to that link and find out if your bomb invests, if your bank invests in nuclear weapons. And if they do, there's a number of things you can do. Go to their Facebook page and tell them take your money out of nuclear weapons. Or you can write to the CEO, or better still, you can take your money out of that bank and put it in a credit union. Who pays for nuclear power and weapons? Well, the public, the taxpayers, have always paid for all nuclear weapons and their related research. And there's a big overlap in funding and research between weapons and power. And power actually serves as a front for the weapons. The cleverly named peaceful atom, that was devised to give a legitimate, non-war-making front to nuclear research and development. The military-industrial complex, they've become increasingly concerned as commercial reactors are closing around the country and new ones have been canceled. And recently, officials in the Trump administration actually admitted that the closing of nuclear power threatens the weapons industry. And the power itself has always been largely subsidized by taxpayers, from the Price-Anderson Act that limits liability for commercial nuclear operators and reactors, to the Department of Energy's oversight and liability for nuclear waste, to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and all their activities, licensing reactors and radioactive waste sites and other industrial sites that deal with radioactivity. So back in 2011, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with the report, Nuclear Power Still Not Viable Without Subsidies. And that stated that in some cases, the subsidies for nuclear power were greater than the value of the electricity produced. So in the recent past and now and in the future, all nuclear power research and development will come from the public purse, because Wall Street won't pay for it and utilities won't invest. Well, the COVID crisis has brought to our attention the vulnerability of the nuclear industry, nuclear power in particular, to pandemics, climate change, and war and other hostilities. So around the world, in some places, the power plants have shut down, but in the United States, they're all operating. So there's a shortage now of skilled workers because of the COVID. They all work in very close quarters, so they can't keep their social distancing. So do you suppose the Nuclear Regulatory Commission might respond with saying, how about closing down if you have so many people sick? Well, no, what they've done actually is regulatory rollbacks. You can work longer shifts now than previously allowed with fewer workers. So 53 plants are scheduled to shut down for refueling in 2020. And it takes about 1,500 workers. They converge on the site and they switch out the fuel. So instead of staying temporarily closed, the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, says, go ahead with your refueling. But hey, you don't have to do those mandatory inspections and repairs and upgrades that we always ask to be done when refueling shutdowns happen. You don't have to do those. Just get back online as quickly as possible. So we understand that the industry has been commandeering masks and personal protective equipment because they didn't really have any to begin with whatsoever. So at the bottom, there's a link to an article that I have written, Coronavirus Hits the Nukes. Keep your fingers crossed. And we're saying that the response that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is giving to overseeing reactors during the coronavirus is keeping their fingers crossed, and they are also washing their hands of any responsibility. So I'm moving on, reaching the end here. Some radiologically contaminated sites in Ohio. There are links to all of these. OSU here in Columbus has a research reactor. It's on Kinnear Road, kind of ironically across from the Museum of Biological Diversity. Battelle had a research reactor in West Jefferson, a few miles west of Columbus. That's now been closed. It's been at least somewhat cleaned up. Buildings are still in use. There are links there that take you to show how well these may not, maybe not so well, have been cleaned up. On King Avenue, the Battelle site here in Columbus, that originally had 9 buildings when they did a lot of radioactive nuclear research back in the day. 3 of those buildings have been torn down. The next 3, RMI, Fernald, and Mound, were major weapons industries back in the 1980s. And they're all closed now, but great challenges in cleaning up. And Fernald, it's now been found even after the cleanup, and a not too bad job was done at the cleanup, but now that is leaking. NASA had a reactor up near Sandusky, quite close to Lahiri. And there's a lot of controversy about the cleanup of that reactor. Piqua actually had a reactor. The Lucky Beryllium site, beryllium is used in nuclear weapons, and that is highly radioactively contaminated. And then we go to landfills where there never was nuclear work done, but that's where they dumped a lot of radioactivity at Uniontown up in Northeast Ohio. That is a Superfund site, and huge issues with poor cleanup there. So there is a website here that lists 38 Ohio factories that used beryllium. 27 of them also used uranium and other radioactive materials. So those are contaminated. And back in the 1980s, there was a list of about 70 places in Ohio where there were take-home projects where people decided they would take home some of these materials and play with them or work with them, and other places where unknowingly people took home radioactivity on their clothes and personal possessions. And other places where materials were handled, such as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the Defense Construction Supply Center in Columbus, have been somewhat, at least, contaminated with radioactivity. So Battelle here in Columbus is a private, non-profitable charitable trust, and they are organized for charitable, scientific, and education purposes. Gordon Battelle, the benefactor, left his fortune to benefit mankind through science. The King Avenue site was opened in 1929. Well, currently, Battelle manages 6 nuclear weapons laboratories, and they have received billions of dollars for nuclear weapons research and development. So back in the 1980s, a number of us were involved when Battelle wanted to increase hazardous and radioactive waste storage from 50 gallons to 500 gallons. But they needed an exemption to floodplain regulations because they are located right close to the Olentangy River. So citizens hired a lawyer. The loss of radioactive materials at Battelle was documented. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, found radioactivity in the workplaces and in the lunchroom. So they got a lot of bad publicity, including publicity from Columbus City Council, and so Battelle did withdraw that request. Battelle, there have been some whistleblowers. Battelle lost at least one nuclear suit, and the DOE then paid Battelle $750,000. That was their litigation cost. The DOE paid them back for what they spent for losing this, when they actually lost this lawsuit. And then another whistleblower said he was forced out. So that's about the end of this talk. I have links here to 3 fact sheets. They're all one sheet that weren't discussed in this talk. A little bit more information on Davis-Besse, a lot more about how exactly nuclear power worsens climate change, and a lot of history about what went on at the Portsmouth nuclear site down at Piketon. So that's the end of my talk, and I want to thank very much everybody for listening, and thanks to Les Clean for organizing this with the people at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Columbus.